Today I would like to draw something that I have never drawn before with coloured pencils. Let's look at drawing a landscape. Now generally speaking, when I draw things I tend to stick to people, animals or food. I'd say I draw objects. So it feels quite challenging to draw something completely different. So let's go through it together and I can show you what I've found. Now first off, I want to start this in the way that I always do. I want to find a reference photo. And I want to be quite careful about how I do this. It's quite tempting to pick a really busy but spectacular photo like this one. But in actuality, I think that that's going to take absolutely ages and seems quite hard. I want something a bit easier to begin with. I want something that is probably reasonably simple in its background and then has a object that's a feature maybe. So after having a look around, I'm going to draw this. Now before I get started, if you would like to draw this with me, it is available on my Patreon. I have a whole host of tutorials covering a variety of different subjects. For each of these tutorials, it includes really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colours I'll be using, sketch outlines and the reference photo. I have some nice and quick drawings as well as some longer but more impressive drawings. Check out the link in the description. Alright, so now I've selected my reference photo, let's start the drawing. And I think the best way to go about this is in the way that I would approach any other drawing. So I've already got my sketch outlines down here, and now I'm going to start with the lightest colour that I can see in each section, gradually work my way towards the darker colours and then back towards the lighter colours. And I'm going to approach this one section at a time. So I can begin here with the sky. The sky is, I'm going to call it reasonably moody. It's a grey sky with a lot of clouds. So the lightest colour that I can see within the sky is a very light grey. And I can literally begin by just putting this over the whole of the background. Now I do want to go about this in the way that I would for any other drawing. So I'm pressing really nice and lightly, which is helped by holding the pencil quite far back, you can see me doing here. And because I do want it to be as smooth as possible, I'm working in circular motions rather than just going back and forth with the pencil. And actually, even just doing this is quite time consuming. Just filling such a large area with a block of colour. It has taken so far about 20 minutes. Now before I go any further, you'll notice that around the edge I have some washi tape. That is because I really like drawings like this where they've got a really clear white border. I think that that looks the neatest. If I put washi tape around the edge to secure it down to the table, it means that the pencil won't be able to go on these areas and I'll get a nice edge without having to be careful. So you can see here I'm going right over the tape at the edge, and it's much faster than if I had to be really precise. So once I filled in the whole of the sky with this light grey pencil, I then want to gradually work my way down through the darker colours. So I'm moving on here to a slightly darker grey, and I can use this to just block in the key shapes of the background. I can still see my sketch here, so that does help with a bit of a guide on what needs to go where. But I'm not worrying about any of the details of the clouds, I really just want to get it all marked out. Now I am still working really nice and lightly here. You'll see I'm still holding the pencil quite far back just to help me press that nice and lightly, because although we are beginning to get the main shapes in, there are a lot of colours that I'm going to want to build on top of this. And I think what I'm learning is it helps to just look at this like it's a series of random objects. So it's kind of tempting to think about drawing a cloud and then think about what you think a cloud would look like, but that's not how I'm approaching this. I'm literally looking at the reference photo and seeing what's actually here, seeing the shapes that make up each area, and just trying to get those shapes in. I think it helps with the clouds that it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect because they're a random and natural shape. It means that if I get it a little bit wrong, it's not really going to notice. But where I can, I do want to get it as accurate as possible. So once I'm happy with everything with this pencil here, I can gradually move my way on to the next darkest pencil. So this is just a slightly darker grey, and I can start filling in even more detail with some of the shapes of background. So the clouds aren't all one consistent colour. They've got lighter areas and darker areas. I can start to fill in some of the kind of patchy look with this darker pencil and try and get things mapped out a little bit clearer. As I've said before, the key with any colour pencil drawing is to gradually build up the colours bit by bit so that we can mix those colours together and build up the depth. And I guess it's not any different with a landscape. If anything, it's probably more important because there's such a rich background that we need to create. There's just so much pencil that needs to go on the paper. And that's the main thing I think I'm really noticing, is there is just so much area to cover. So it does take a lot longer than doing a more simple drawing or a smaller object. So once I filled in that darkest grey, I can then move on to the darkest colour for this drawing. This is the black pencil, and just still very lightly fill in those darkest areas. And then I've already got a sky that does look quite cloudy and moody. What I want to do at this point is think about the main colour that's missing. So the main colour I would say is missing is the clouds are a little bit too monotone at this point. Obviously I've only used greys and blacks, so that does make sense, but I want to inject a little bit of colour. The colour that I think is missing from the reference is blue. So you can see I can go over all of the clouds, a lot of those grey areas, really adding a little bit of this blue. And by adding it in lightly, it's not overpowering the background, but it is adding in some sort of colour. And actually I would say that that is, on the most part, all that we need to add to the background. So from here for the sky, I'm going to work my way back down through those colours. So starting off by building up a lot more black, and at this point I'm not necessarily pressing harder with the pencil, I'm just going over all of the areas more times to build up that colour. Now this is where it is so important to have a sharp pencil. The colour's going to go down in a much smoother way with a nice and sharp pencil. I find it goes a little bit kind of, I don't know, like lumpy if I don't have a sharp pencil. And then all I'm going to do is work my way from, as I say, that darkest pencil towards the lightest pencil. So I can fill in back exactly the same as I did before, but just more colour with this darker grey. I can then move on to the mid-tone grey and really start filling in a lot of those areas that aren't extremely light. And then usually at this point I would move on to the lightest grey, but I'm not going to right now. What I'm going to do is draw in the rest of the picture and come back to those lightest grey areas at the very end. Once I've drawn in the tree and the grass, I think it will be much easier to see if there's anything else I need to add, particularly to the sky. But I have finished the first section. From here I can go through exactly the same process again, but with a series of greens this time. So starting with this very light kind of yellowish green, and I can fill that in over all of the areas I can see a hint of this colour. And then once I'm happy with the light green, I can gradually work my way down. Now it's worth right now taking a minute to talk about the tree. Now the tree is interesting. If you actually look at a photo of a tree, you kind of think it's made up of a series of leaves, but in actuality those leaves have a number of shadows in between. They're kind of sorted into sections. So what I want to do here with these greens is not worry about any of the texture, just add in those sections. So you can see that I've already filled in the lightest areas with that lightest green. Now with this mid green, I can start filling in some of the more mid and darker areas, and hopefully it'll begin to be a bit more obvious what I mean by the clumps of the tree, and we'll look at the tree a bit more in a little while. So once I've got something down on all of the areas of the tree, I can then block in pretty much anywhere that I've got white paper showing on the grass. And I want to be once again pressing lightly, working in these circular motions, gradually building up the green. And once I've got green everywhere, I can then keep working my way through the darker colours. So from here, the next darkest colour, I think it gets much, much darker, and it's more like a very dark brown. So I can start off on the tree, filling in the tree trunk and putting this in any areas that are particularly dark on the tree. And then I can start filling in any of the darker shadowed areas within the grass. So generally speaking, this is where one hill is meeting another hill, but also all the way along the bottom. And then from here I can move on to, again, my darkest color. This is the black, and I want to be pretty much putting this in those same places. So where the hill meets the other hill and all along the bottom. And I'm just going to keep building up that black, going over it again and again and again, still not pressing hard, wanting to press really nice and lightly, just gradually building it to get that contrast looking right down the bottom. And then once I've built up a certain amount of the black, at this point I can start pressing a little bit firmer, but fading it out into the area above so that I have got a really solid black along the bottom. And you can see quite quickly this, although it doesn't look amazing, it is starting to look like a landscape drawing. So at this point I'm just going to focus on the hills and the grass, and I'm going to work my way back down through those pencils. Exactly the same pencils that I used before, so here I'm now pressing reasonably firmly with the darker brown in all of those same areas I did before. From here I can move on to that very dark green, going over the brown and the black. I find that if I leave the black it looks a bit harsh, but if I go over it with brown and green it kind of tones it down, but you still get that very dark tone. And then once I've gone over the whole area with that very dark green, I can then go over the lighter areas with the light green, and in fact in some areas I can just blend this out with a tiny bit of white. So now most of the drawing I'm very happy with. I want to focus on the focal point. The tree I think is going to bring the whole drawing together. And I haven't drawn a tree before, so it's taken a little bit of thinking to work out how to draw the leaves. Now, because it's quite small within the photo, I obviously don't want to draw each individual leaves. What I'm going to do is work again from lightest to darkest and back to light. But you can see here I'm just making some really small spots. I want to create the idea of the texture, but not spend ages drawing in every single detail. Now, one thing that I've noticed that I think is key to drawing this tree is around the edge of the tree. It's not a perfectly straight line, obviously. It's a natural object and the leaves are kind of sticking out randomly. So I'm really focusing on that, trying to follow where possible the line around the edge of the tree from the reference photo to try and help make it look as realistic as possible. So I can carry on building up all of these little dots, or kind of like a series of very small circles. So here I'm doing this with the darker green. I'm really going through exactly the same colors as I did on the grass, because I find that that's going to help bring the whole drawing together. So this is the darker green. I can then move on to the dark brown, really focusing on building up more of the dots in the patches that are darker. So when you look at the tree, you'll see it is kind of split into sections. I want to build up the darker brown and the black in a second in those darker areas. If it was all just one consistent color, it wouldn't look very realistic. So here I'm still building up all of those dots with the black pencil now. And then once I've done this, I can work my way back down. So back to the brown pencil, going over that black to try and tone it down. And actually I'm going to add a bit more brown in a few other places, just a little bit more than I did before, because I think it helps blend the black darker areas a bit better into the lighter areas, makes the sort of transition not as harsh. I can then go back to the darker green here, and that's made a big difference to the tree. You can see it kind of looks like a painting, which I think is really cool. And then I can move on to the lightest green and just smooth it all out. So that is pretty much the drawing done. I'm going to add a few final details and then that's it. So actually, drawing a landscape doesn't seem as different to drawing any other picture. I think my main takeaway is it takes longer just because you're drawing a larger area. But the basic idea, although it seems more overwhelming, is basically the same. I'm still working generally from the lighter colors towards the darker colors and back to the light. You're just kind of filling in larger areas, there's less detail. So do let me know if you have tried a landscape drawing before with coloured pencils. I'd be really interested to know your findings. I have enjoyed this just because I really love the end result. I will definitely be going back and drawing more landscapes in future. It's cool. It was simpler than I expected. All right, happy drawing guys, and I'll see you in the next one.